The Case of the Gentleman's Gambit. Sack-laden carts destined for Covent Garden Market, private carriages and Metropolitan Police Black Marias on their way to the law courts held Bow Street in a stranglehold of congestion. Complaints from horse and driver alike were drowned out by the cacophony of hooves and wheels scraped and rattled by uneven cobblestones. Dense black clouds suffocated the skies, darkened the morning, and drenched the streets with rain. Airborne soot and dirt which had settled upon the parlour window now slid down its cold glass in waves of grime which collected upon the stone ledge. The strong winds within the chimney breast tugged the fire in the wrought iron hearth, whilst the parlour's gas lamp struggled to dispel the gloom. Perched upon a tete-a-tete sofa opposite the fireplace was a 25-year-old gentleman with short, waved auburn hair and a clean-shaven, fair complexion. His hazel eyes appeared to shimmer with the reflection of the dancing flames as he and the furniture cast long shadows across the dark, polished floorboards behind them. Every inch of his forest green, double-breasted, three-piece suit had been tailored to his well-built, 6-foot frame. His pristine, white cotton shirt and starched Eton collar, meanwhile, were indicative of a domestic servant's hand. Shadow hid half of his face as he turned toward the occupant of an overstuffed armchair to his right. "Mr. Treves," recommended the Bow Society. He glanced at the handwritten letter in his hands. "He told me how members of your group, an architect and veterinary surgeon to be precise, solved the case against his late friend's dog. Hardly a matter for the police's attention." He gave a contrived but fleeting smile, "but nonetheless demanding investigation. I have his letter of recommendation here if you wish to read it." "I trust your word, Lord McCreary." Though elder than her guest by 3 years, her flawless complexion alluded to the contrary. Her dark brown eyes were emotionless as she maintained a rigid posture against the armchair's back and rested manicured hands in her lap. Chestnut brown ringlets cascaded from her crown to hang loose between her shoulder blades, whilst the high standard of her silk burgundy bustle dress matched her guest's tailor-made tie in both cut and quality. Its dense skirts were impeccably arranged and long enough to conceal her laced-heeled boots. The garment's upper half followed the smooth contours of her corseted torso and framed her ample bosom with a Queen Anne neckline. The flesh of her chest was covered by a panel of black netting that had also been used to create sleeves. Intricate silk roses had been sewn along the waistline and the lower edge of the neckline. "I have a matter of similar triviality. At least it appears thus on first examination." Lord McCreary folded the letter upon his knee and slipped it into his jacket. "In that it is a matter of great importance without crime. For now." "For now?" Lord McCreary rose to his feet and approached the fireplace. "I fear I'm being dishonest with you, Miss Trent. For, you see," he turned to her with clasped hands, "I came here expecting to place my confidence in a gentleman, someone like Sherlock Holmes. I believe private inquiry agent is the correct term for such a person?" "It is." He walked across the hearth rug toward the door that was set ajar. When he reached the edge of the rug, though, he held his clasped hands against the underside of his chin and faced her once more. "I must confess being informed of the actual, far more unorthodox arrangement of bearing my soul to you for the purposes of judging the worthiness of my commission has both perplexed and concerned me. As you said, Lord McCreary, the Bow Society investigates cases which are outside of the police's usual remit. I have therefore heard all manner of stories, from Mr. Treves' hound to gruesome unsolved murders. Our members, assigned and supported by me in my capacity as the Society's clerk, have investigated and successfully solved them all. With this and Mr. Treves' account in mind, you may be confident in our competency." Lord Rees McCreary rubbed his hands together as he meandered back to the sofa and sat. He then flattened his hands, held the tips of his thumbs against his upper lip, and gazed into the fire. After several moments of quiet contemplation, he murmured, "I do." He settled his hands upon his lap and gave a bashful smile. "You must think me foolish." "Not at all. Yours is a common assumption amongst our clientele." Miss Trent's polite smile and reassuring tone were well rehearsed, a skill derived from her acting days to conceal her consternation at the repetitive patriarchal response to her occupation. "Let us start from the beginning." She took a notebook from the mantel-shelf. "Please describe to me as fully as you can the precise events which have brought you here." She opened the notebook at a blank page and readied her pencil. "There is a young lady, Miss Imogen Thornhill, who I intend to marry." Lord McCreary's eyes became fixed upon the pencil's movement as Miss Trent transcribed his words. "I love her with the entirety of my being, and ours would be a most agreeable match besides. Her beauty, charm, and wit are without comparison amongst this season's debutantes, so she's naturally received a great deal of gentlemanly interest. One of them is a close friend of mine, Mr. Elwood Baxter. A gentleman of independent means like me, he's one of London's most eligible bachelors. Yet, also like me, he only has eyes for Miss Thornhill." His gaze shifted to the rug as, in a sober tone, he recollected, "The bitterness of her rejection has been as devastating as the agreement to marry." "And she has agreed to marry who?" He hesitated and averted his eyes. "Me, of course." He fixed her with his gaze once more. "But Mr. Baxter has vowed to do the same despite my attempts to convince him of his foolhardiness." He sighed. "For the past month he's refused to receive me at his home, and declined all my dinner invitations. He's even attempted to come between Miss Thornhill and me. But something has happened since. He has invited me to join him in a game of cards tonight." "And you have reservations about attending?" "Yes. I feel ashamed in my suspicions, but I've known Mr. Baxter since we were boys. To many, the invitation would be as innocent as it appeared, an olive branch of peace between friends. Nonetheless, the more I think of our friendship, and how fiercely he resented my pursuit of Miss Thornhill, the more I suspect he means me harm." Lord McCreary rose and paced the hearth-rug. "I know it's wicked to even consider such a thing, but my fear is intense and unshakable." Miss Trent lowered her notebook. "Has Mr. Baxter said or done anything specific to give credence to your fears?" "No, I feel a blackguard saying it aloud." He sighed. "I want to believe our friendship will protect me, but gentlemen see the world differently when love has clouded their senses. To put it quite simply, Miss Trent, I would feel reassured to know your members were close by, keeping an eye on proceedings." "That's understandable. Where are you and Mr. Baxter to meet?" "At a gambling house near Piccadilly Circus. It's not easy to find due to its public premises being a bookshop, but I'll inform the proprietor to expect some members of the Bourse Society, and he'll ensure they're admitted." Miss Trent smiled. "Ah, yes. We're familiar with that particular gambling house already." She continued to write in her notebook. "The Society accepts your commission." Lord McCreary visibly relaxed. "Thank you. Who should I expect?" By evening, the wind had dropped and a full moon hung in the ink-black sky. The bitter cold air remained damp though, and small streams flowed in the gutters of Coventry Street and Shaftesbury Avenue. Yet, despite the malodorous weather, hansom cabs and private carriages battled their way through the chaos of Piccadilly Circus, where many of London's major thoroughfares converged. Omnibuses laden with passengers followed their criss-crossing routes whilst avoiding the occasional pedestrian. Amongst the sea of vehicles was a four-wheeler carriage led by two chestnut-brown mares. Its driver wore a top hat, a heavy black cloak with gold bands, and black leather gloves. The carriage itself was decorated in black lacquer, with gilt detailing upon its doors, handles and edges. A golden P intertwined with an L was painted on the carriage door's central panel, with a square border surrounding it. The driver navigated the vehicle through the chaos with expert precision, and brought it to a standstill outside the Criterion Theatre and Restaurant. Its door swung open and a riding boot lowered onto the external step. Passed by its counterpart as its owner lighted onto the pavement, its leather was scuffed but clean. Crowds ebbed and flowed around the 38-year-old man as his dark brown eyes scanned each face before it was lost. The right side of his jaw and cheek were marred by old burn scars, whilst coarse brown stubble covered his upper lip and chin. His right hand, though motionless against his side, appeared to pull on his arm despite his tremendous bicep and broad shoulder. The severe angles and rigidness of its bent fingers were also unnatural. A battered walking cane was tucked under the same arm. Coupled with his boots, charcoal tailcoat and beige cotton trousers, it alluded to a country life. However, the perfect posture of his 5-foot frame and close cut of his grey flecked brown hair suggested a more austere and disciplined existence. Returning to the carriage's open door, he inquired in a soft Dublin accent, "How will we know we've met Lord McCreary?" Miss Trent instructed him to wear a red handkerchief in his breast pocket. A pale-complexioned gentleman replied as he alighted from the carriage and stood beside him. A full decade younger than he, the gentleman had high cheekbones and dark circles beneath his green eyes, both of which were softened by powder. His short, golden blonde curly hair was his most distinguishing and therefore recognisable feature. Taller than his fellow passenger by 9 inches, he wore black trousers with a wide-skirted, silk-lapelled frock-coat cinched in at the waist. His burgundy waistcoat was adorned with gold-embroidered roses to complement his tie-pin and cufflinks. A burgundy cravat, framed by a starched collar, rested against the crisp white backdrop of his shirt. He scratched his hand through his white cotton glove, put on a silk-top hat, and stood to the left of the open carriage door with his bent arm lifted. A slender hand covered by a midnight blue silk glove emerged from behind the red velvet curtain and rested upon the offered arm. A lady of 30 years followed as she too stepped down onto the pavement. At 6 foot, she was taller than her fellow passengers, yet her heeled shoes and sculptured mound of tight dark blonde curls pinned atop her head made her taller still. Matching her gloves in colour, her gown had a compact bustle over her behind. This transitioned into a cascade of silk, with each layer increasing in size until it ended in a wide round train. The gown's bateau neckline preserved her modesty, and a stole of black fur provided a hint of warmth. Diamond, teardrop earrings hung from her petite ears, and an impressive teardrop sapphire and diamond pendant hung from a broad necklace of the same. Her dark blue-green eyes studied the faces of passers-by until she caught sight of a bright red amongst the swirl of blacks and browns. Upon further scrutiny, she saw a handkerchief tucked into the breast pocket of a gentleman standing by the restaurant's immense window. She pointed at him and then rubbed her neck to conceal the action. "He resembles Miss Trent's description of Lord McCreary." "He does," the Irishman agreed and closed the carriage door. "Please return at 11:30. The blonde-haired gentleman instructed his driver, who nodded and G'd on the horses with a simple flick of the reins. "There's something about this I don't like," the Irishman remarked. "If he's that afraid, he shouldn't have come." "How much damage can be inflicted in a busy gambling house, though?" the woman observed. "We shall discover the answer soon enough, I'm sure," the blonde-haired gentleman added, and led his fellow passengers to the handkerchief's owner. The moment he was within earshot, he inquired, "Good evening. Am I addressing Lord Rhys McCreary?" "You are." Lord McCreary looked to each of them in turn. "May I presume our mutual friend sent you?" "You may." The blonde-haired gentleman extended his hand. "I am Mr. Percy Locke, an illusionist and proprietor of the Paddington Palladium." Lord McCreary gave his hand a firm squeeze. "This is Dr. Lynette Locke, a physician with her own medical practice on Cleveland Terrace. She is also my darling wife." Percy smiled. "And this is Mr. Callahan Skinner, the Morell's bodyguard and former officer with Her Majesty's Royal Navy. We are also members of the British Society, here to accompany you this evening." Lord McCreary stared at Dr. Locke until his mind registered the third gentleman's introduction. "Oh. Yes, forgive me. It's a pleasure to meet you." He extended his hand to Mr. Skinner, who gave it a brief shake. Dr. Locke was offered a contrived smile as he observed, "I don't believe I've ever encountered a woman doctor before." "You're qualified, then?" "Yes. I graduated from the London School of Medicine for Women," Dr. Locke replied. "Then I'm reassured," Lord McCreary's smile warmed. though I hope I shan't be in need of your expertise this evening." "Miss Trent told us about your friend," Mr. Skinner interjected. "How likely is it he'll harm you?" "It's as certain as the sun rising in the morning," Lord McCreary gravely replied. "Then, begging your pardon, sir, why come at all?" Mr. Skinner inquired. "Have you ever been in love?" Lord McCreary inquired. "Not boyish infatuation, but truly, madly, deeply in love?" "Once," Mr. Skinner replied. "Then you'll understand when I tell you I have no choice in the matter. This is something I simply must do," Lord McCreary replied. "Nevertheless, I would recommend you refrain from eating, drinking, or smoking anything whilst in Mr. Baxter's company," Dr. Locke interjected. "Does Mr. Baxter have a gun?" Mr. Skinner inquired. Lord McCreary's eyes widened. "I certainly hope not." "Where is Mr. Baxter now?" Percy inquired as he consulted his pocket watch. "He entered the gambling house a few minutes ago. I don't believe he saw me, however." "Excellent." Percy tucked his pocket watch into his waistcoat. "I am rather familiar with the establishment, so I would suggest you enter ahead of us to avoid arousing Mr. Baxter's suspicions. We shall wait here for precisely 5 minutes and then enter ourselves. If you and Mr. Baxter decide to play your card game in one of the private rooms, please leave the door ajar so we may identify your whereabouts without making inquiries amongst the workers." "Very well." Lord McCreary fortified himself with a deep inhalation followed by a soft sigh. "We shall meet here again at 11. The first thing one noticed upon entering the bookshop was a mahogany-panelled counter that dominated its small interior. Shelves full of old books covered the opposing wall. 3 gas lamps, suspended from the ceiling down the shop centre, illuminated the immediate vicinity. The remainder was left to the mercy of the dark and cold alike. Sitting on a high stool behind the counter was a scrawny man in his early 50s with a faded apron tied around his waist. Upon hearing the jangle of the bell above the door, he lifted his bulging head to regard Percy, Dr. Locke, and Mr. Skinner with bright pale grey eyes. An open book laid on the counter in front of him. He wedged his hand into its centrefold and closed it. "Greetings, sirs and madam. How may I help you this fine evening?" "We wish to peruse the books you have in storage," Dr. Locke replied. "There's a particularly rare edition my husband is keen to purchase." "Yes, quite," Percy replied. "Go to the door at the back and pull the bell," the scrawny man replied, pointing to the shop's rear. "Roland, my assistant, will be happy to help." "Thank you," Percy replied. A bright knob bell hung beside the indicated door. When Mr. Skinner pulled it, a muffled clang sounded, followed by silence. This, and the failure of the door to open, prompted him to retrieve his cane from under his arm and cast a sideways glance to Percy and Dr. Locke. The emaciated proprietor, meanwhile, had resumed his reading as the distant sounds of Coventry Street drifted through the shop. "Where's this Roland, then?" Mr. Skinner murmured, only to be answered by the sound of metal scraping together behind the door. A fraction of a moment later, the door creaked open on its hinges to reveal a middle-aged man in a chocolate-brown suit and tie, cream shirt and black bowler hat. He peered through the gap at them, his beady eyes studying Mr. Skinner and Dr. Locke's faces first. Upon seeing Percy's, though, he pulled the door wide, tipped his head and tapped the brim of his hat. "Good evening, sir." "Good evening, Roland," Percy replied. "These are guests of mine, my wife Lynette and Mr. Callahan Skinner. We seek an evening of joviality and gambling." "Very good, sir," Roland replied. He stepped into the bookshop and kept his arm against the door as they entered. "All of this convoluted subterfuge has made me see why you enjoy visiting this particular gambling house," Dr. Locke observed after the door had slammed shut behind them. "But of course," Percy replied. "Why endure the mundanity of simplicity when one may enjoy the thrill of covert exclusivity?" The compact room they'd entered was windowless, with a single wall-mounted gas lamp. Opposite them was a second door covered in green baize, with greater bulk than the first. In the centre was a small glazed aperture that slid back to reveal another set of eyes peering out at them. The rest of the viewer's face was in shadow as he gave a soft grunt. The door was then opened wide to reveal a set of deep red carpeted stairs beyond. The banisters were wrought iron leaves and vines crowned with a polished oak handrail. Gold and cream-striped paper adorned the upper halves of the walls, while oak panelling covered their lower. Ascending the stairs, the Bow Streeters then passed through an open doorway into a long room with decor like the stairwell. A high, plaster ceiling covered in ornate roses, tall windows framed by thick red velvet curtains, and a duo of tables standing side by side in the room's centre were the main additions. An immense roulette wheel sat on top of the first table, whilst the second held the components of the game hazard. Both were covered by white cloths, and surrounded by middle-aged gentlemen of means. Standing in the space between the tables were two younger men attired in long-sleeved white shirts, plain burgundy waistcoats, and black trousers. Every so often the man by the roulette table issued the command of "no more bets," before he spun the wheel and sent the little white ball on its way. The floor was covered by a red, densely piled carpet to muffle the footfalls of both patrons and servers as they moved between this room and its neighbour, the latter of which was visible through an open doorway and held an innumerable number of dark oak tables spread out across a broad area. A handful of gentlemen occupying the tables nearest to the fireplace dined on a supper of cold chicken, joints of ham, and salads, etc. Sitting at a nearby table in full view of the doorway was Lord McCreary with another gentleman, who the Bow Streeters assumed to be Mr. Elwood Baxter. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with dual, unkempt black moustaches and a neat beard which covered his rounded lower jaw. His cobalt blue eyes were crowned by thick eyebrows, whilst his short black hair was slicked back from his tall forehead and combed into a neat side parting. He was attired in a black frock coat with matching waistcoat, trousers and cravat. Gold rings adorned his manicured fingers, and a gold chain hung from the watch in his waistcoat pocket to his buttonhole. There were no telltale bulges upon his person as far as Mr. Skinner could see, lending him to accept Lord McCreary's early assertion that Mr. Baxter was unarmed. The distance and din of indistinctive conversations between both rooms prevented either Lord McCreary or Mr. Baxter's voices from reaching the Bow Streeters, however. Mr. Skinner therefore headed for a vacant table in the adjoining room. He spoke into Percy's ear as he passed behind him. "I'll get closer." Percy hummed his acknowledgment and sat at the end of the roulette table. Fortunately, the view of Lord McCreary and Mr. Baxter was unimpeded. He also saw Mr. Skinner sitting at the neighbouring table to face Mr. Baxter, whilst keeping Lord McCreary's back to him. "Bring me some good luck tonight, darling?" "Of course," Dr. Lock replied, and stood behind her husband with a hand upon his shoulder. "Some chips, please," Percy requested from the croupier, and put down several banknotes. At the same time, he observed Mr. Baxter take a sealed box of playing cards from his pocket and place it in the centre of their table. With his fingertips still upon it, Mr. Baxter then pushed it toward Lord McCreary. "You may do the honours," Mr. Baxter said. Mr. Skinner put his rigid right hand upon the table with a dull thud and ordered a whisky from a server. "I was surprised by your invitation," Lord McCreary replied as he opened the box, removed the cards, and shuffled them. After everything that's happened, we should put the matter to rest once and for all," Mr. Baxter interrupted. "Miss Thornhill made her choice." "She did." Lord McCreary dealt the cards. "But your stubbornness continues to be a wedge between her and me." He put the pile of remaining cards in the table's centre. "We love each other and—" "Stop this foolishness," Mr. Baxter growled. "Can't you see the damage it's causing? Aside from being demmed uncivilised, you're behaving like a lunatic." Percy put 4 chips onto black 5. Starting at his neck, Lord McCreary's face steadily flushed as if port had spilt under his skin. Only you could make such ungentlemanly remarks and think little of it. He bristled as he gathered up his cards and formed them into a fan in his hand. "But rest assured, my friend, you shan't go unpunished." Mr. Baxter played his first card and took another from the top of the pile. "I was hoping you'd be willing to listen after all this time." He frowned, but clearly I was mistaken. Lord McCreary licked his index finger, selected a card and tossed it down as the crimson faded from his complexion. Licking his index finger for a second time, he then took another card from the pile and added it to his hand. "I am being reasonable." He met Mr. Baxter's gaze. "I'm allowing you this last game of cards." "No more bets, please," the croupier directed, and the white ball was tossed into the spinning roulette wheel. Percy and Dr. Locke paid little attention to it, though. Instead, they watched Mr. Baxter play his next card, followed by Lord McCreary licking his index finger to select another card and toss it down. "Black 5, the croupier announced. Several groans sounded from around the table. Percy, on the other hand, already contemplated which number to bet his winnings on. Within seconds of the croupier clearing the table, he placed 2 chips on red 9. "We were good friends, Reese," Mr. Baxter replied, and played his next card. "We could be again. All you have to do is accept the truth. Your truth." Lord McCreary licked his index finger and played his next card. Licking his index finger again, he took another card from the pile and added it to his hand. "Not mine." He pulled out his balled-up handkerchief, pressed it against his lips, and coughed. Licking his lips afterward, he then appeared to chew on his tongue. "You always thought you were the superior one between us, always winning at sports, always winning whatever you turned your hand to, including cards." "No more bets," the croupier directed, and the roulette wheel was spun once more. Mr. Baxter exhaled through his nose. "The secret to cards is to not allow your opponent to know what's in your mind. Each card player has a habit they may not be aware of that does just that. You, for example, always lick the same finger before you touch any of your cards." Lord McCreary furrowed his brow and coughed. "I do not." He coughed again. "Red 2, the croupier announced, and swept the chips from the table with a hooked walking stick. "Bad luck, darling," Dr. Locke remarked without conviction. Distracted by their client, she watched as he licked his index finger and selected his next card. A violent cough caused the card to topple from his hand, though. It was immediately followed by a fierce coughing fit that erupted from Lord McCreary's chest with such force his face turned crimson. "Something's wrong." Dr. Locke moved around the roulette table and headed for the adjoining room. "Could I have some brandy, please?" Mr. Baxter requested from a nearby server. At the man's nod, he put down his cards and leaned over the table to inquire, "Are you sick?" Mr. Skinner rose from his chair when Dr. Locke entered from the other room and moved around his own table to meet her halfway. "He was playing cards and just started coughing," he told her in a lowered voice. "I saw," Dr. Locke replied. I don't know," Lord McCreary replied, and rubbed his chest as another violent coughing fit commenced. "Forgive me, Elwood, I do not feel well." He dropped his cards, gripped the table's edge, and tried to stand. His coughing worsened as he gasped for air before suddenly he collapsed sideways onto the floor like a rag doll. All at once Dr. Locke, Mr. Skinner, and Mr. Baxter rushed to his aid. "Reese!" Mr. Baxter cried as he dove from his chair and onto his knees beside his unconscious friend. Shaking Lord McCreary by the shoulders, he then glanced around at the small crowd that had gathered around them. "Is there a doctor here?" "Lift him onto his chair," Dr. Locke instructed Mr. Baxter, whilst Mr. Skinner gathered up Lord McCreary's legs. "He needs a doctor," Mr. Baxter retorted. "I am a doctor," Dr. Locke replied. "Now help him onto his chair." She took the glass of brandy from the returning server, sniffed it, and handed it back. "He is in no condition to drink this." Seeing Percy amongst those gathered in the doorway, she requested, "Can everyone give Lord McCreary some air, please?" "Please, do as she suggests, gentlemen," Percy said, as he stepped in front of the others and spread his arms wide. "We would not want our good luck to leave us before we return to the gambling tables, would we?" Several mutterings of displeasure and annoyance at being given instructions by a woman sounded from the group, but it dispersed nonetheless. Dr. Locke, meanwhile, felt Lord McCreary's forehead and held her bare hand close to his lips. "He's still breathing," she said before a distinct odour reached her nostrils. Leaning closer, she sniffed his lips. "Almonds." "Have a glass of salt water, a bucket, and a police constable fetched at once," she instructed Mr. Skinner, who nodded and left her without hesitation. "Whatever for?" Mr. Baxter demanded. "A snifter of brandy and he'll be fine, surely." "Brandy shan't dispel Lord McCreary's affliction, sir," Dr. Locke replied in a grave voice. It would appear he's been poisoned by cyanide. Mr. Baxter stared at her. Don't be absurd. He couldn't possibly have been poisoned. He has the scent of almonds upon his lips, a sign of potential cyanide poisoning, Dr. Locke replied. But Reese didn't eat or drink anything the entire time he was here, Mr. Baxter replied, dumbfounded. He is quite correct, Percy interjected as he returned. I saw no food, liquid or cigarettes pass his lips. He ran his eyes over the table. The only things he touched were those playing cards provided by you, Mr. Baxter. I don't like what you're insinuating, Mr. Who are you, anyway? I'm Mr. Percy Locke, an illusionist. Yes, I recall seeing your posters now, Mr. Baxter interrupted. This is Dr. Lynette Locke, Percy continued, as he indicated his wife, who was speaking to Lord McCreary to garner a response. And the Irish gentleman is Mr. Callahan Skinner, a former officer with Her Majesty's Royal Navy. We are here at Lord McCreary's invitation in our capacities as members of the Boat Society. Have you heard of it? Vaguely, Mr. Baxter muttered. But why would he need to invite anyone to our card game? He feared you meant to bring harm to him, following Mr. Imogen Thornhill's decision to accept his proposal of marriage over yours, Percy explained, which by all appearances you have succeeded in doing. Lord McCreary groaned. I don't believe he's imbibed a fatal dose, Dr. Locke said, and frowned, which is far larger than most realise. And how may you be so certain? Mr. Baxter inquired in a sardonic tone. I've studied poisons and their effects since I was involved in an investigation of a poisoning case with the Bow Society, Dr. Locke replied. Mr. Baxter pursed his lips together and clenched his jaw. Appearances may be deceptive, however, Percy continued. Given it is an accepted fact neither you nor Lord McCreary consumed or inhaled any substances during your card game, one must deduce the potential source of poison must be the cards. However, both of you touched them, so, logically, both of you should have been affected. You seem to be in perfect health, though. Of course I am, Mr. Baxter growled with narrowed eyes, because there is no poison on those cards. He pointed at them. And Miss Thornhill accepted my proposal of marriage, not his. We are to be married within the week. Lord McCreary licked his fingers several times during the game, but the traces of cyanide would have been minute if the cards were indeed covered by the poison. Dr. Locke mused aloud. A thoughtful expression then descended over her features as her mind's eye replayed Lord McCreary pressing his handkerchief against his mouth, and the violent reaction he had soon after. Her train of thought was derailed by the return of Mr. Skinner with a server carrying a glass of salt water in one hand and a bucket in the other, however. Roland is getting a constable now, Mr. Skinner informed him. This is beyond fantastic, Mr. Baxter remarked, stunned. I did not poison the cards in the hope Reese would ingest it by licking his finger. You already knew it was his habit to lick his finger, though, sir, Mr. Skinner interjected. I heard you tell him so yourself. Mr. Baxter lifted his hands to his head and muttered, I cannot believe this is happening. He dropped his hands to his sides. This is absolute lunacy. Dr. Locke took the glass and instructed the server. Please hold the bucket on Lord McCreary's lap. If he dies, I shall hold you all personally responsible, Mr. Baxter cried as he pointed at Lord McCreary's limp form. I wouldn't plan his funeral yet, sir, Dr. Locke replied. Mark how his lips have remained pink despite how he apparently struggled to breathe earlier. She pressed the rim of the glass against Lord McCreary's lips and felt some resistance against it. With a wry smile, she gripped Lord McCreary's nose between her thumb and forefinger and waited. What the devil are you doing? Mr. Baxter demanded and attempted to lunge for her hand. Mr. Skinner at once blocked his approach with his arm, though, and stepped in front of him. She knows what she is doing, sir. Mr. Baxter glared at Mr. Skinner, but nonetheless waited with an expression of fearful anticipation. Dr. Locke tightened her grip, and suddenly Lord McCreary's eyes and mouth sprang open. As he then involuntarily inhaled, Dr. Locke poured a thimbleful of salt water down his throat. Lord McCreary immediately ejected the foul-tasting water and erupted into a barrage of coughs and splutters. Ugh! He wiped his mouth with both hands, leaned over the bucket and spat several times into it. Dr. Locke removed the glove, dipped her hand into the bucket to retrieve a small cream-coloured fragment, and held it up to the light. She announced, Gentlemen, this is the remnants of the almond Lord McCreary concealed in his handkerchief and chewed shortly before he performed his charade. She dropped the fragment into her husband's hand and replaced her glove. He has imbibed as much cyanide as I have. Mr. Baxter stared at Lord McCreary in stunned silence as the colour drained from his face. But why? Mr. Skinner inquired. One presumed he wished to sully Mr. Baxter's reputation by arranging for him to be arrested for attempted murder, Percy replied. Such a scandal would remove any possibility of marriage between him and Miss Thornhill, thereby creating an opportunity for Lord McCreary to take his friend's place at the altar. Lord McCreary coughed and wheezed. She's mine! I loved her first, Elwood. The constable's here, Roland interjected from the doorway. The Bow Streeters all looked to Mr. Baxter, but it was Mr. Skinner who inquired, Do you want the constable brought up, sir? Mr. Baxter clenched his hands into fists at his sides as he glared at his former friend. No. He approached Lord McCreary and stood over him with hard eyes. As he looked into Reese's glaring, bloodshot ones, he felt the last fragments of their friendship disintegrate like old leaves swept away by the autumn wind. The despair that remained brought words to his lips which Oscar Wilde would also write in his private letters. The heart was made to be broken. Mr. Baxter swallowed as Lord McCreary's demeanour remained unchanged, and the realisation struck him. But his is broken beyond repair. How, then, can the cold judgment of the law succeed where the warmth of friendship has failed? He unfurled his fingers. Let him be reminded that his wickedness lost him Miss Thornhill when he witnesses our marriage. May his hatred devour him from within, and his soul be damned as a result. He cast a sharp glare at the Bow Streeters, and may the rest of you be damned for helping him. He then strode from the room, tossing a card onto the floor as he went. The constable shan't be required after all, Roland, Percy said. Should I telephone Miss Trent? Mr. Skinner inquired. Yes. Percy retrieved the card and turned it over. It was the Ace of Hearts. Tell her Lord McCreary is most anxious to speak with her, if you think he is well enough to travel, darling. Dr. Locke smiled and placed a hand upon Lord McCreary's shoulder. Without a shadow of a doubt.